So, hi everyone, welcome to our second talk of the first 2023 Knauss Fellowship Lunch and Learn Seminar. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Brianna Yancey, and I am a current fellow working with the Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Lab. I'm a member of the Lunch and Learn Committee, and I'm the moderator for today. So now you will hear from Natalie Lord. Natalie recently earned an MS in Natural Resource Management from the University of New Hampshire. Her research focused on the intersection of sustainable marine food systems and social equity for the aquaculture industry of New England. She has devoted her career to assisting coastal communities with the sustainable management of their marine resources. Natalie grew up on the coast of Maine and enjoys spending time with her family and friends in the great outdoors.
Thank you, Brianna. So today I'm going to be presenting my master's research. I just graduated in December, and happy Women's History Month. It's a great topic for this month. So all the photos you see in this presentation were taken from my research participants. I used a methodology called Photo Voice. It was developed in the 1990s, and it is a community-based approach. So the participants took photos and wrote narratives about all of the photography you see today. So for this photo, Joanna Fogg is from Bar Harbor. She titled this Upweller, so that's what everyone is standing on here, and it is a nursery for the oyster larvae. And she acquired this from a lobsterman. It used to be an old lobster pound. So for this photo, she wrote, "The summer I was 17, I got my first job as a sternman on a lobster boat. I would show up at the dock in the darkness before sunrise and be the only female getting out to work. Sometimes there were lewd comments and gestures. It can be an intimidating space for a young woman. Now I go out of my way to flood our docks and boats with women. I find jobs for even the smallest girls in my family so that the waterfront not only becomes a place where we feel safe and welcome, but also our own." So in this photo is her niece and her daughter, and she went on to talk about how she believes that sea farming can be a job for anyone, and it can have folks from different backgrounds, different genders, ages, and you don't necessarily need a lifetime on the water in order to be able to start a business. Okay. Advanced slide. So here we have the sustainable food system. As most of you know, aquaculture is currently making a big splash federally. We have several federal priorities right now to expand offshore aquaculture in domestic waters. We have about 50% of our seafood that we consume is coming from aquaculture sources, and most of that for the United States is coming from international markets. We currently have a $17 billion seafood trade deficit. So we would like to expand aquaculture here in the United States. We have a great understanding about the environmental and economic components of this food system. So we know that oysters provide ecosystem services like water filtration, and we know that aquaculture can provide coastal economic development for communities who are experiencing declines in wild capture fisheries. However, there has been less of a focus on the social components of the industry. So in order to have a fully interdisciplinary food system, we need to have social components as part of this research. So it is an emerging research area in the literature. And by focusing on the social components, we can understand more about resource management, distribution of benefits, and equitable engagement in this industry as it continues to develop here in the United States. So fisheries and aquaculture has historically been male dominated, and that's largely due to cultural norms of masculinity for the industry as a whole. We have some norms that include superstitions that women are bad luck on boats, to women being not strong enough to take on the job of harvesting on the water. So due to these gender norms, women have often been overlooked in this industry. But globally, they're present at every part of the food system, and they make up half of the workforce in the seafood industry. However, because their contributions are not recognized, they're often found in the processing, marketing, and distribution portions of the food system. So these are lower paid positions. They have very little room for upward economic mobility, and they have very little decision-making capabilities. So here in New England, we actually have some of the more women oyster farmers than anywhere else in the country, to the best of my knowledge. However, this is not documented in state agency data collection. So we know a lot about how many fish we catch, how much they weigh, what size they are, but we know very little about the people who are responsible for bringing seafood to our tables here in the United States. So for example, NOAA does not collect comprehensive data on the fisheries and aquaculture sector. Other agencies like the USDA have demographic data collection throughout the whole agriculture industry through the Census of Agriculture. So this is something that we might be able to do in the future. I've spoken to the state agency staff that manage aquaculture from Maine to Maryland, and no one collects demographic data there either. However, this is a focus area for NOAA Fisheries. They have recognized this demographic data gap. They have prioritized the identification of vulnerable communities, equity and environmental justice in the 2022 Equity and Environmental Justice Strategy. And then there's also a focus on it with the Human Integrated Ecosystem-Based Fisheries Management Research Strategy as well. So due to the lack of gender data collection, we have had public policies and natural resource management tools developed without the perspective of women's experiences in this industry. So my research is the goals of this research are to share stories about women's experiences to make the case to collect data like this. I hope to analyze barriers and opportunities for women who are working as oyster producers, and then see the ways in which a social network is used as a tool for them, and then to make aquaculture recommendations for gender integration into aquaculture policy. So the overall goal is to support women's participation in the industry and to improve our knowledge of pathways into these roles so that other marginalized groups can enter the industry and have opportunity to be a part of the working waterfront communities here in the US. So I developed an interdisciplinary analytical framework. So my social science coming out here, I'm not going to dive into this, but these are some of my variables for analysis. I drew on institutional analysis and gender analysis frameworks from the literature, from Eleanor Ostrom specifically. So looking at what made up an aquaculture action situation. So combining the gender analysis variables, so identifying gender norms, but then also looking into where the positions are and then what information sharing was occurring in order to answer my research questions. So I had a two-part research design. I conducted a food system survey that went out to the whole aquaculture or oyster aquaculture food system. So it included oyster producers and harvesters, but also oyster seed producers and marketers. The goal of this was to gain perspective on the perceptions of gender in the industry, and this survey was inclusive of different genders. I had a 51% response rate. I also conducted a lease analysis, so looking at women who are holding leases and versus their male counterparts. And the ultimate goal was to see if there are any resources and barriers that differed by gender. And then the photo voice case study, I worked with 4 women participants, and this is a photography and visual storytelling methodology that's based in feminism theory. It was developed by Wang and Burris in the 1990s, and it's used to engage and empower people in communities that don't necessarily have a voice or don't necessarily have a large decision-making role. So there are a few parts to this methodology. Women were the leaders of this. So I stepped back as a researcher. They took photos and wrote narratives, and then we had one-on-one interviews, a focus group, and then the participants decide what they'd like to do with the photographs after, and these women decided to make a website, which I will share with you at the end of this presentation. So here are some photos of what oyster farming looks like in Maine and New Hampshire. Everything's still small scale here and family owned. And as the industry continues to expand, people are trying to keep the benefits of the industry locally here in our working waterfront communities. So as you can see, everyone has different farm designs. In the bottom left-hand corner, there is oyster grow, which is an industry standard, floating cages. We have boats of all different sizes, from kayaks to skiffs to lobster vessels. And then in the upper right-hand corner, we have a bottom cages. So Laura can only access her site at low tide, but she designed it that way. That's how she likes to grow oysters in Great Bay, New Hampshire. So I'm not going to spend too much time on my lease analysis, but Maine has a tiered leasing structure. So there are limited purpose sites versus leases. The leases here that I have are 20 years, and they can be up to 100 acres. So these are like the best you can get. New Hampshire only has one system, but as you can see, we are a leader for women-owned operations, but there is still a discrepancy for the amount that they have in this industry currently, but it is growing, which is exciting. So some survey results. This survey asked demographic information that is new data for the industry. We had 13 women and non-binary participants and 26 men. The race identification was 100% white. The sole proprietor and oyster farm's primary income was actually pretty close with the genders. Food system participation, everyone took part in all stages of the food system. And I believe this is because their businesses are still small scale and they are able to do all parts of the sector. And then average time in the industry was 4 to 10 years. In Maine, we had barriers to the leasing system. NIMBYs are the opposition from the landowners, and then access to the waterfront. Resources were Maine Sea Grant, aquaculture and shared water training, and other oyster farmers, and that was a huge resource for the folks in New Hampshire. It's a much smaller industry there and is more emerging than the Maine aquaculture industry. So barriers there include low level of state agency support, and then they also have problems with landowners and oyster poaching as well. And then there are fewer processing facilities and farm access as well in New Hampshire, just because it is a smaller area for growing. So the result from the survey that stood out to me the most was regarding gender discrimination. 46% of the women and non-binary participants have experienced differential treatment on their oyster farms, compared with 0% of men who took the survey. So gender discrimination can reinforce practices of gender inequality, it can limit women's safety at work, and it can diminish their ability to make entrepreneurial advancements. People, organizations, and networks were important for everyone. And as a barrier, that was more referencing to the NIMBYs, the landowner challenges. Funding opportunities held the most discrepancy between genders. So women indicated funding as more as a resource, and some of the male participants wrote in the qualitative portion of the survey, I'm self-funded, or I don't require any funding, while one of the women wrote, additionally, being a single parent woman with limited income and working a full-time job, I've yet to find any other funding sources other than myself. This has been a barrier. Training opportunities were also had a bit of a difference between genders, with women indicating training more as a barrier. And one woman wrote, 0 training opportunities specifically geared toward women and minorities and their specific challenges and needs. So social networks, as I said earlier, are important for everyone, and I was able to dig into who makes up the social networks for men and women and non-binary with the qualitative portion of the survey. So in the write-in portion, the men indicated more institutional actors like Maine Sea Grant and the Down East Institute, while women indicated friends and family and other oyster farmers, so more informal network actors. And with the photo voice interviews and focus group, I was able to learn more about what might be making up or why there is a difference in the social networks. So I worked with 4 women oyster farmers. These are the 4 main themes that came from this case study. And all 4 women have faced gender discrimination while working in the waterfront space. And this is mostly stemming from the historical gender norms. Alicia told a story about putting her boat in the water. She's photographed here on the left. She was very nervous. It took her about an hour to back the boat down. And she was at the public docks, and she only had about a foot of space to work with. And a crowd had gathered by the time she put the boat in the water. And someone yelled down, "How come he's making you do all the work?" Because her boyfriend was helping her. And she said, "Well, this is my truck, that's my boat, and we're heading out to work on my oyster farm." So gender norms are pervasive in their everyday lives, and these women are constantly questioned about their abilities to be working on the water and owning an aquaculture operation. But they have found ways to work against those norms. So in the photo voice interviews, we were able to identify 3 main gender norms that the women face. And the number 1 is the perception of the maritime industry as being male dominated. So often the women are overlooked in decision-making settings, or they're not recognized as stakeholders in the industry. The second gender norm was childcare responsibilities. So one participant chose to be an oyster farmer specifically in order to create a schedule around her daughter's school schedule. And then finally, differential treatment as a woman. And one of the outcomes is sexual harassment in the workplace on oyster farms and in the working waterfront space. So these women are fiercely independent, and they design their businesses in order to have full autonomy over their decision making. So they really they keep their farm small scale because they want to have control over every portion of the food system. So they are growing the oysters, processing them, and then they are also marketing them in the best way that they see fit in order to avoid gendered outcomes. One of the barriers that was highlighted by the participants was gear and equipment. So as you can see in this photo, the woman is standing on a box, and this is an oyster tumbler. And Joanna took this photo because her staff member is like over 6 feet tall, and he can fit at the tumbler fine. However, her female coworker has to find ways to stand at the tumbling machine. So Joanna wrote for this one, "Most boats and equipment have not been designed or built for us. It's hard to work at a table that requires you to have your hands above your shoulders all day. It's hard to stand out by being the only one that doesn't fit. These are things we're working to change." So these women are very collaborative, and they often choose to work directly with other women in order to learn different techniques to make their farming operations more efficient and to avoid occupational health and safety risks. So when we have women working on a farm, everyone benefits. So the solution that Joanna has is she goes out of her way to hire other women. "Sea farming is physically demanding work. The limits of my small frame can be very evident in the course of the day on the water. Finding innovative ways to maneuver and learning to work collaboratively is a big part of our daily life. I have found working with women particularly rewarding because we have an aptitude for finding unconventional ways to get things done, and we expect to help each other by towing the same line and pulling the same cage." So training opportunities, as very similar to the survey, were also a barrier, and that's largely because the women are often the only women in the program, and they find that the curriculum that's provided in the training programs don't necessarily meet their gender-specific needs. So this quote discusses a training program. She was the only woman participant, and she felt really out of place because the way I conduct business is so different from the way they wanted me to conduct business. And I felt like if I'm not scaling up and fitting in this mold of what a lot of people want to see me in aquaculture. So Amanda here works with other women farmers in the area. There's quite a few actually where Amanda's farm is. Lane's Island. So here she writes, here I'm with another oyster farmer doing some reconnaissance for her upcoming standard lease hearing. From the air we look so small, which is odd because that's not how I feel when I'm out there. Of all the people I work with in the area, her and my friend Emily are the easiest to get along with and the most inspiring and relatable. They're both supportive, tenacious, and independent. So in order to overcome these barriers, the women in this research have developed alternative social networks that are made up of other women and informal network actors. I'm more likely to call up someone that I know or to respond to someone that seems smaller. I'm more comfortable with another farmer that I know as opposed to trying to get through an association that might be a bit more intimidating. So with these 4 main barriers, the women turn to other women in the industry in order to learn different farming techniques, different growing methods, to cultivate a network of support, to dismantle gender norms, and to access capital, as well as just general farm support and aid where they can't necessarily afford to hire a year-round staff. So in conclusion, the lack of gender data collection has impacts on social and economic progress for women in this industry. And in the era of climate change, these small-scale producers, like the women in this research, can't afford to have, when we have a climate shock, like a storm that wipes out their farm, they can't necessarily restart their business as quickly as an operation that has more resources. And so the last thing they need to worry about is finding clothing that fits or finding a box in order to be able to process their oysters. So this research can make a case study for other regions of the United States. As we know, the Gulf of Maine is experiencing rapid changes in ecosystem health, and this will be an important contribution to aquaculture development in the rest of the nation, because it will only be continuing from here on out. So now is the time to address gender and social equity to build a truly sustainable domestic seafood system. So some policy recommendations I have are to invest in the network, invest in women's networks and allow them to design the networks themselves. Offer women specific training and funding programs. So this could look like something reduce licensing fees for socioeconomically disadvantaged groups, or a microloan program. And then also collect demographic data alongside our economic and environmental data. So with better demographic data collection, the industry will be able to track change over time and monitor, how we're doing with gender equity and hopefully advance gender equity in the future. This photo is Amanda's farm at low tide. So all she uses is a bucket and her oyster seed. So it's very accessible for her, and many other women are trying to actually use the same growing method, because at low tide, if she falls off her boat, she's up to her knees in water, so she can go out alone at all times of the year. So this is the Photo Voice website. It's called Rising Tide Photo Voice, and you can read their stories and see the rest of the photographs from the women in this research. So next steps for Natalie, I'm going to continue working with New Hampshire Sea Grant on my research, and then publish this in an academic journal article, and continue my Knauss fellowship with the Ocean Acidification program. And then I'm also pausing, but I am a PhD student at the University of New Hampshire, so that will be my next steps in the future. Thank you so much, everyone. And I would like to thank New Hampshire Sea Grant and the Switzer Foundation, my research participants, and my lab members for all the support. My email's right here.
Here's a question. What will you study as a PhD student?
So my hope right now is to continue. I'd love to do one chapter on the demographic data gap that we have. So doing another case study approach, looking at the entire seafood system in New Hampshire, from harvest all the way to processing and then marketing. So that will be another survey-based case study. And then I'm hopefully going to be working on small-scale fisheries in Madagascar, looking at the role of gender for marine protected areas and fisheries management.
Great.
Those are my goals right now.
Well, while you were sharing your goals, 3 questions popped in the box. This first one says, love the idea of a USDA census of aquaculture. Please continue on this track as it's such important work.
Thank you.
This next person says, although it's important for women to support women in the small environment, how do we get their voices up to those larger federal agencies to help them grow?
That is a great question. This presentation is a good example of that, but I think that's why I'm focusing on the demographic data collection, because that is, how what people look at for policy change. So continuing work like this and continuing sharing their stories so that folks can recognize that they're here and they're working in this industry and that they have different needs will be as what we can do for now. That's my plan.
Excellent. What organizations might be poised to offer the women-specific training?
So we have a few actually in Maine that are starting curriculum for women-specific training. Maine Sea Grant is, as well as the Island Institute, which is a nonprofit. So they are looking at developing gender-specific aquaculture training programs for Maine aquaculturists.
Excellent. This person says, hi, Natalie, such interesting and meaningful research you do. I'm curious if you've ever drawn on the international case study of the Ha-Enyu, female divers from the South Korean province of Jeju and their semi-matriarchal family and industry structure. If not, something to check out that mirrors a lot of your research questions / objectives.
Yes, I have definitely looked at that, and there's the majority of the literature on gender in fisheries and aquaculture is actually from abroad. So yes, that I've definitely looked into that. So thank you.
This question asks, how did you find the women who participated in the narratives, and were they paid to contribute?
So the women, I used the survey that went out randomly. And then I also identified, so because there is no gender data in the aquaculture data portal. So I had to make an assumption based on their names if they were women. And then I cross-referenced, looked at their websites, looked at their businesses. So it was a mix of purposive sampling. So we knew we wanted to work with women who are owning their farms as sole proprietor for photo voice. And then we had a portion in the survey if they were interested in continuing the research. And that's how I found a few of them as well. They were compensated. It was very minimal, but yes, I gave them as much as I could.
That's really interesting. Well, that's our last question. Thanks again for your presentation and for sharing your work with our community. And Brianna Yancey, who did the introductions, I appreciate all your hard work getting the word out about the seminars today.